We have folks pretty much here, so I will go ahead and start liberally using the mute button. David, if you want to officially introduce our guest author.
Yes, it is a real pleasure. It is my great pleasure to finally get to introduce Stephen Kiernan, who was slated to be our very first Booktopia author for this year. That's Booktopia 2020 was, going to be our annual literary weekend, and he was the first person, first author we signed up for it, but alas. So anyway, we're getting to see him today, which is great, and his book has been, the publication date has been delayed as well, but we are still trying to do this, and we're going to send a pre-order link in the chat you can take a peek at. Stephen has published nearly 4 million words. For 20 years, he worked as an award-winning journalist. In addition to this, he's an accomplished guitarist, a healthcare advocate, and the writer of a 2019 manifesto that, when I was reading it today, was disconcertingly prescient. His latest novel, Universe of Two, will be published on August 4th. It follows 3 other novels that have been celebrated in 2 books of nonfiction. Beatrice Williams said of it, "Rarely does historical fiction get everything so right. He leads us along a journey of conscience as complex and infinite as the science itself." Please join me in welcoming Stephen Kiernan.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and it's really fun to see some familiar faces and names of Booktopians and other people that I've seen before. Thanks for being here. I have to start with an anecdote about a friend of mine who had a birthday the other day that was a significant numeral. And he decided, he sent an email out to everybody, and he said, "I'm not going to be able to see you on my birthday, but I would love it if people would come. And I'm going to be on the Zoom from 6 to 8:30. And maybe people from elementary school, I mean, anyone can come at any time, but if you're between 6 and 8:30, let's make it elementary school, or 6 and 6:30, and then 6:30 to 7, let's make it high school, 7 o'clock on college, that kind of thing." And he sent it around to enough of us that this man is, by the way, a lifelong bachelor, that a whole bunch of us, when it came time to sign in, we changed our screen names to Old Girlfriend. And so he had about 40 old girlfriends that wanted to chat with him on his birthday. I'm glad to see most of you, it looks like you have your actual names there. And I don't see any old girlfriends in the conversation. If I'm not able to see all of you at once, but it would give me a general idea. How many of you have taken a look at an advanced copy in some form of Universe of Two? Are there a few? Okay. Well, we're not going to give away the dragons, okay, or the poison. We're going to keep all that stuff secret. What I thought I'd do is introduce you to this book in 2 ways. And the first is just to start it, the way that we all encounter a book. Here's a cover, right? And it can tell you that it's a love story, and you can tell by their fashion that it's not contemporary. And that's what you have. And then you have Jenna Bloom saying something nice on the front and Beatrice saying something nice on the back. I'm just going to read you the first page, okay? And that's where we'll start the conversation. Dangerous to start with the reading, but it's short and sweet, I promise. I met Charlie Fish in Chicago in the fall of 1943. First I dismissed him, then I liked him, then I ruined him, then I saved him. In return, he taught me what love was, lust too, and above all, what it is like to have a powerful conscience. On first impression, Charlie was weak-chinned. To my girlfriends, I might have called him a milk toast, soft as an old banana, which only goes to show how smart a 19-year-old girl is about anything. Now I know better. Turns out the greatest kinds of strength are hidden and move slowly and cannot be stopped by anything until they have changed the world, which he did twice. I'm not exaggerating. I was there on both occasions. One time I helped him, the other time I hurt him. I hadn't intended any harm, but there's no denying that I used my influence to make him do terrible things, irreversible things. He forgave me. That was in his nature. But I haven't forgiven myself. even now, all these many years later. Some deeds are like tattoos, and the ink of regret is permanent. How did it start? As innocently as the chiming of a bell when a shop door opens. I was in the back office when I heard it ring, letting me know a customer had come in. This is how we begin. The person who is speaking is Brenda Doobie. She is a very smart and sassy 19-year-old Chicago girl. It's 1943. And she was accepted to the Oberlin Conservatory in the keyboard program, piano and organ. And she worked, but was not able to go because of the war and her family not being able to afford it. And them questioning whether or not a girl needed a college education. So she's working in the family piano store and organ store. And the person who's just come in the door is Charlie Fish. He is an unimpressive guy, skinny as a pencil, kind of nerdy, and kind of soft-spoken and overly polite. And he can't really talk much about what he's doing. He's just doing math for the war effort. And he's part of a whole group of guys in Chicago that are doing all kinds of math to plan for how you feed a battalion, how you get fuel to the troops' vehicles, how you supply an aircraft carrier getting across the ocean, all those kinds of things. How do you make sure you have enough bullets? How do you make sure you have enough coffins? And Charlie's been asked to do this particular kind of math that is very complicated for him. And so he wanders the streets of Chicago in his time off. He's originally from Boston. And he was an old choir boy in college, so he hums along with himself as he goes. And what he's trying to do is just kind of figure out this math. It turns out he's good at it. He and Brenda start up a romance. Just when things are getting going, he's given a promotion, which sends him to Los Alamos, New Mexico, where he is kind of against his ethics, ordered to participate in the construction of the atomic bomb. And particularly, he works on the detonator team. Some of the math and other things that he learned in Chicago become essential for the function of the bomb. And his romance with Brenda continues, but he's not allowed to tell her what he's doing. So anytime that he feels moral misgivings about what his job is, what this weapon might accomplish, he's not allowed to tell her. And she just says, hey, soldier up. You know, my brother's in Europe. My father's serving in San Diego. You know, my best friend's husband's about to be in the Japanese invasion. Be a man. Well, when the bomb succeeds, has its devastating success, Charlie feels a burden on his conscience of what he did. And when Brenda finds out what she urged Charlie to do, she has that weight of guilt also. And so together, they set out to spend the rest of their lives seeking redemption. And they find it. The story of how they find it together is mostly implied, but it's all built in there. And I think that in some ways, this is primarily a love story. The cover's not a lie. The love is bigger than the bomb in this, but it's also about how any of us recovers when we do something that isn't entirely true to our conscience, and what kinds of redemption there are. I'd like to read another little bit, and then maybe we can have some questions. The part I'm going to read is a little bit from their first date. It does not go well because it's snowing very hard, and Charlie doesn't really have winter clothes with him. It's November, but it's an early snowstorm, and so he arrives late and soaking wet. And so they go to a diner, and things at the diner don't go very well either. But sometimes when things go completely wrong, it turns them around and makes them go right. So here's a little section of, I'm going to say a page and a half, maybe twice as long as the last piece. This is after they've had lots of snow, soaking wet, freezing cold, and a terrible diner where they can't even get their water glasses refilled. She's just decided there's no way this guy is getting a good night kiss. Then the theater saved us. There was no line at the ticket counter, no one waiting for popcorn, and when we ambled into the half-lit rows of seats, we saw that we were alone. It must have been the snow. There was no one else in the whole place. I hope you don't mind that I arranged a private viewing, Charlie said with a big smile, his arms wide like a showman. So expensive, I marveled. You shouldn't have. And we were friends again. For the newsreel, we sat right in the middle. It opened with the usual marching band music, the image of an eagle in attack pose. The horns sounded flat, F notes bending sourly down toward E, but I blamed that on the projector. The news began with the launching of 2 new Navy ships, which were gigantic. One of them, the announcer said, was the most heavily armed cruiser ever. Next, we saw Red Cross volunteers packing boxes of food, medicine, and cigarettes for Allied prisoners of war. Gary Cooper, last year's winner, awarded the 1943 Academy Award for Best Actor to Jimmy Cagney for his role in Yankee Doodle Dandy. I loved that picture, Charlie whispered to me. Me too, I whispered back. Then, I don't know where the impulse came from, but I jumped up, running to the far right-hand side of the room and the back row. After a bewildered second, Charlie saw the game in it and trotted after me. The movie was about a military ship that might be haunted because the captain kept doing odd things. The first officer was supposed to be heroic because he was handsome, but he kept striking poses in profile that made him look like a mannequin. At one point, Charlie stood in the aisle and imitated one of the poses, his chest puffed out and chin pointed up, and when I laughed, as loud as I pleased, he ran across the center seats and sat on the far left side, down front. Oh, I came skipping after him. If that picture was actually suspenseful, we were having too much fun to notice. We sat in probably 10 places, each time making more of a racket, each location tumbling into each other a bit more as we sat. As fun a date as I can remember. As the last credits rolled and the end, it was perfect. Perfect. We sat in our front row seats, not going anywhere. That is the best movie I have ever seen, Charlie said. That is the best movie I have ever not seen, I replied. We stayed till the lights came out, and then a minute more. Let's wait till the crowd thins out, he said. I was so pleased I could have pinched him. Now, all these years later, I wish I could recall the name of that movie. I would gladly watch it from the recliner in my little assisted living apartment. Would it all come back to me? This is the moment I ran to the back. Here's where Charlie posed in the aisle. Could this is when our hands touched on the armrest between our seats. Could the silly scenes and weak dialogue replay that night we had? Or better, bring Charlie's presence back to me? I would watch every movie made in 1943, no matter how boring, to have my hand accidentally brush against his for half a second one more time. That's Universe 2. Game on. And
Thank
you
you.
are the
That was
first people
wonderful.
I have read it to in the world, in the universe.
Well, thank you. That was a great reading, Stephen.
Thanks. You know, I've been told all my life to slow down and to speak up, and I've never managed to slow down. But when I'm on Zoom, people can hear me.
Wonderful. Well, if there's anyone that has any questions, again, you can please put them in the chat or let us know that you have a question if you want to ask it personally. But let's start off. I've got a question for you, Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
So the work at Los Alamos was obviously top secret. What kind of research did you have to do to give the reader a sense of what was going on there, what life was like?
Well, great question. The research for this book was a big part of it. I should say that this book took a little more than twice as long to write as the one before because I had so much I needed to learn. And part of it was that I needed to know stuff, but not necessarily have it in the book. Like I needed to understand how a nucleus works to understand the atomic bomb, but none of the readers needs to know that. So in terms of the Manhattan Project, I read deeply about it. There are some excellent books that are sort of the definitive stories, the making the atomic bomb, for example, spectacular books. And I read a lot of those. There also were a number of wives of scientists who, after the war, wrote and self-published memoirs. And I read a number of those. And those really were very helpful for explaining what life was like there. And then, of course, I went there. And I'll tell you, Los Alamos is an interesting place in some unexpected ways. If you go to Gettysburg, you can get a map, and it will say 600 boys from Pennsylvania died in a charge on this hill on this day. If you go to Pearl Harbor, you can walk out on that platform, and there is the USS Arizona on the bottom of the sea, right there at your feet. If you go to Los Alamos, it is scrubbed. All the evidence, all the buildings, there is no memorial. There's a very, very modest museum. There's a separate museum from the city, but in terms of like in the actual place where it happened, it's quite scrubbed. And so the result is I wandered around with these self-published books that had maps inside them, trying to figure out where everything was. And I became very well acquainted with the security officers, and they became very well acquainted with me. And you know, I was glad I'd worked in newspapers, so I wouldn't let myself get too intimidated, but they still were pretty intimidating. And it was necessary to go there and see, among other things, that Los Alamos is beautiful. It's, you know, gorgeous, right near Bandelier National Monument. It's gorgeous, Ponderosa Pine, and it's up, you know, up above a canyon. You know, there was a famous National Geographic picture one time that was of a kind of a spire of stone in the Himalayas that had a Buddhist monastery on top. And that's a little bit what Los Alamos feels like, except that it's a city of 10,000 people now. Most of them work at the National Lab, which to this day is doing, you know, the nuclear research. The important thing I think about the historical research is that the distinction to make is I'm not really looking for facts. I mean, I want to know the facts. I want to be factually correct. But what I'm really looking for is the human element. I'll give you two quick examples. One is that Los Alamos, although it was a collection of all the smartest people on earth at that time, they were unable to avoid having sour milk. All through the war, the milk was sour. And people would, every once in a while, they'd be like, oh, they got a new delivery service, they got a new refrigerator, and they take one sip, sour milk. And you know, you think of that experience when you don't check the milk first and you taste sour milk, and that's kind of a universal disgust. That was a human thing. The other thing was the relationship between the scientists and the military, right? They were completely enclosed by fences, and there were guards there that were there to keep people out. They were also there to keep the secrets in. And their feeling was that we have rank and order and duty and roles and uniforms and all of that. And here are these absent-minded weirdos walking around all hours, day and night, unwashed, unshaven. They had no idea what they were working on. And so there was this animosity that existed, this cultural friction between the military and these geniuses. And it was very, very important to the military people, and the geniuses were completely clueless. They were unaware that they were hated because they were so busy and they were so focused on the work that they were doing. And I thought, like, that's like such a great dynamic for a novel, that someone's very passionate about something and the other person's completely clueless. And of course, then the military sees the bomb test, and that's an eye-opener for them. But those are the kinds of things that you look for. And there was an abundance of it. I learned a ton that is not in this book, but now is in my noggin.
Thanks, Stephen.
Great question from the chat from Barbara Morrow, who is a co-owner of the Northshire and founder of the original Northshire. And she wanted to know, is this book written completely in the voice of a woman? And if so, how was that process of writing for you?
Oh, great question, Barbara, and I always can count on Morrow to pin me. No, it's not told just in a woman's voice. There are two voices because one of the voices needs to have a security clearance. Okay? I think I would have written the whole thing in her voice if there'd been some way I'd been able to describe what Charlie was doing all day. But instead, he's inside the fence, and she's not allowed in ever. And she never, in fact, goes inside the fence. years later, when she could go see it, she doesn't want to. And so, so there are two voices. One is hers in first person in alternating chapters, and the other is a third person that is quite close to Charlie, but is not Charlie. And that follows him in the labs in Chicago and in Los Alamos, and where they go together afterward. And, you know, I'm often asked about writing female narrators because, you know, this is my fourth novel, and one was third person, but close to a woman. One was four narrators, one of whom was a woman, and one was entirely first person of a woman. And what I think is, of course, you have to be very careful, and you count on your early readers to, and the people you work with, to keep you from making any really flagrant, dumb mistakes. I am fortunate that I have, you know, my agent is female, my editor is female, the marketing director is female, the publicity director is female, and three of my four early draft readers are female, and all of them are perfectly happy to slap my face. So that's the police. But the other side of it is really any narrator, any narrative voice is an act of imagination. And it either works or it doesn't. You know, how did a 58-year-old guy from Hannibal, Missouri, manage to speak like a 13-year-old boy from 50 miles downstream, right? And yet he did. Somehow the act of imagination was so great that the reader completely forgot that these are black marks on a white page. And instead, a dream started in the reader's mind, you know, like a little movie. And the reader does all the set work and the temperature and the lighting effects and the music in the background, right? Galway Cannell said this is about 1/3 of the transaction, right? It's actually imagination speaking to imagination. And so the challenge is to write any narrator in a way that the reader forgets I exist, forgets the world exists, forgets the book exists. The characters follow him or her around when the book is on the shelf. They can take the book and stop, like, I gotta go to sleep, close it and put it down. Maybe it's 4 nights before they get back to it, open it, and boom, the dream starts right back up again. Like, that's the challenge. And that's the same challenge whether my narrator is a man who was born in 1860, as I had in one of my novels, or a science journalist, which I had in one of my novels, or a hospice nurse, which I had, or in this case, a kind of sassy 19-year-old girl from Chicago. I have to think a lot like a 19-year-old girl from Chicago when I'm writing her, and I count on my goalies to keep me out of trouble. But really, it's about how can I help the reader's imagination make her as vivid as possible.
Thanks, Stephen. There's a question here from Monica that I think follows from this, and she was wondering what inspired you to write Universe of Two? How are you inspired to this story?
Thank you, Monica. I think there are a couple of parts to it. One is that I was writing something that wasn't working. And I was 200 pages into it, and it was not working. So my mind was open. The second thing was that I had spent a lot of time in the research for my novel, The Hummingbird, with veterans. And I was seeing how they all reconciled themselves with the things that were required of them during the war. One guy was a sniper, and he said it was very interesting to be, you know, in a certain ethical world all of his life, and then be trained and be sent to Vietnam, where his job was to be a murderer, and it was not only okay, it was good that he was a good murderer, and then come back to America and not be a murderer ever again, and like be okay with that, and how hard that was for him to reconcile in his healthy adult life, and how people come to terms with what's required of them in war. And it's the thing I've been thinking about since I finished that book, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago now. And I ran across the story of a guy who had been on the detonator assembly team and detonator design team in Los Alamos, and his regrets during the war, and some things that he did to find redemption. I would tell you those things, but it would be a terrible spoiler. So I'll just say that that guy became interesting to me, and enough that I read everything I could about him. He has a biographer, and I met with her. I met his daughter and interviewed her. I thought I was going to write a book about him. And it turned out that he was a real person. So he was infinitely too complex, and there were too many kind of cross paths in his life. But there were things about his struggle that I thought were, as I said before, sort of the way we all struggle. I mean, I think every human being knows what it's like at some time not to live up to your conscience. We've all done it. We're all imperfect. And the question is, how do you live with it? Do you suppress it? Do you heal it in some way? How do you mend that? And so this guy in the real world came up with a pretty interesting way of mending it. And so I just took that and thought about it deeply and wrote a story and let the story figure out how the character would mend it. So he's based very loosely on a real guy, but really just the bare bones. And I can't even remember what the question was.
No problem. I think that actually segues pretty nicely into a question that our bookseller Sue Rice had, who loved your book after she read it.
Good for Sue. I love it. Thanks.
Yeah, she said, in writing this novel, your main character's consciences are really challenged. How did you decide to so desperately challenge the main character, and then also his wife's, and then how she, I don't want to give too much away, how she encourages him then later on? I'll leave it at that.
You know, I don't want to be at all political. I will just say that in public discourse today, we have an absence of conscience. And I worked in newspapers for a lot of years, and I wrote editorials, which, you know, is probably an annoying role for somebody to have. Their job is to kind of needle the world, but it also makes you think about stuff a lot. And I was thinking a lot about, you know, the guy with the notions of grandeur who, you know, got the rights to the AIDS drug and then quintupled the price, right? People like that, that there's just insufficient attention to conscience. And my conscience rides me all day long. If I make every mistake I make, my conscience just does not let up, which I suppose is, you know, my parents' voice still in my ear. But so I thought it would be interesting to write a novel about conscience. And, you know, what would you do if you were a guy smart enough to know how to build a component of something? They haven't even told you what it is yet. And it's not till well along in the book that Charlie finds out what he's building is part of the bomb. And in fact, because it's a detonator, he's given the nickname Trigger. And everyone calls him Trigger. And he hates that nickname because it's true. And it just, every time they call him Trigger, it's a dig against his conscience. And so I actually did a little reading about conscience. I spoke with clergy of a bunch of different faiths about conscience. There was one divinity student whose her whole area of expertise and emphasis and study, she's writing her dissertation about conscience. And I was like, how can you live with yourself? You know, it's just, so this is why the love between them is so important, because they have to help each other with their consciences. It's why the love is the centerpiece. But I think that those challenges, for me, it was a kind of suspense. You know, there's the suspense of, is the guy going to jump out of the bushes with a knife? That's Alfred Hitchcock suspense, right? And there is the, will he get there in time to cut the rope away and get her off the railroad tracks? And that's like a physical kind of suspense. And this was a kind of moral suspense. To what extent are these people going to go against their consciences? And how are they going to feel afterward? And how are they going to mend it? And that was, for me, it was an interesting thing to explore in its own kind of propulsion for a story.
I've always been fascinated by Robert Oppenheimer's second act and his crisis of conscience after the war. Did his writings and experiences play into your research and thinking as you were working on this?
They did. I thought that he was a pretty brilliant, pretty cagey guy. And, you know, he was walking a very fine line. Oppenheimer was the director of the Manhattan Project. And so his job was to create this weapon, if it could be made, and to be sort of the bridge between the military and the science. And there's one line in the book that I think sort of captures it, where they're feeling like maybe this won't be used, and a guy says, right around the time that the scientists' curiosity has been satisfied, that's right around when the military's interest gets very keen. And so they think that maybe this bomb will be tested somewhere. And so the world can see what it's capable of, and the Japanese will surrender, or maybe they can just tell the world it exists. And that does it have, and eventually they're convinced that it will not be used on people, and then of course it is. There were two bombs dropped, right? Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There were also two more bombs assembled and ready to be dropped, and the Japanese surrendered before those were used. I believe, I'm not certain, one of them may have been scheduled to be dropped. And imagine if we dropped four of them. In fact, they turned out to be pretty powerful deterrents. Here we are all these years later, 75 years later, and with all the tests and the proliferation of nukes into other countries and the many different ways of mechanisms for delivering these weapons, since Nagasaki, not one. There is kind of a stalemate. There is kind of a recognition that they are too devastating. Again, my mind wanders. Does that answer the question? I mean, I think like Oppenheimer after the war, he questioned a lot the use of the bomb. The result was that he was stripped of his security clearance. There was a congressional hearing at the end of which he was declared a communist. His last official speech at Los Alamos, he said that if we didn't get together as a world and take control of these weapons, that the day would come when the world would curse on the words of Los Alamos and Hiroshima. So he very much repudiated the work that they had done.
I think that dovetails nicely with another question we have here in the chat from Molly Brundle. She says she sees that you had attended Johns Hopkins, and she did, and when she was a student there, she attended an ethics class in which her professor brought in the bombardier from the Enola Gay. And so what can you say, if you don't want to get political, this is historical, I understand. Do you believe the U.S. had to drop atomic bombs to cease hostilities?
In human history, whenever there's been a bigger weapon, we've used it. It's a matter of human nature, whether we like it or not. Bigger catapult, rifle, mustard gas, we've always used it. The difference with the atomic bomb is that it's not an indiscriminate weapon. If I point a rifle at a soldier from an opposing army, that's who I'm aiming it at. When you drop an atomic bomb, you don't just kill the military, you kill every human being, every plant, every animal, the puppy dogs, the works. And that creates a unique ethical question. One of the wonderful freedoms of writing fiction is that I don't have to decide. And I do have, I think, characters in there with many points of view, including people who feel like the bomb is an essential thing, people who are uncertain. There's a woman whose husband is going to be participating as a medic in the invasion of Japan. She loves the bomb. It saves her husband's life. She's completely unapologetic about it. And I think that there's a whole spectrum of beliefs around it. And I don't think it's, I don't write didactic fiction. It's much more like, here are some really, really interesting questions, and people who feel these ways and have to reckon with that in their hearts. And I think that reflects how we all have different views about the bomb. And 75 years later, I don't see that there's any more consensus than there was in 1945.
So there's a great question in the chat from Dorothy Hoteling, which actually dovetails to one of the things that David and I have been asking in all of these Northshire Lives. It's both what you've been reading lately in this time of pandemic, and then also what you've been writing lately and how writing has been going in isolation.
Hello, Dorothy. Let's see. I've been reading weird stuff that goes along with the book that I'm writing now. And so the thing I'm reading right at this moment is called Deep Survival. And it's about people who are in really, really dire circumstances and who makes it and who doesn't. So when you have, a raft overturned in a raging river and there are 8 people dumped into the 40-degree water and the water's moving at 20 miles an hour, why do 3 people make it and 5 don't? What is it about those 3 people? You have 20 people in a huge climbing expedition, and somebody's protection goes and they pull all kinds of people with them, and 12 of them have die in the incident. What did the other 8 do differently? You have people whose sailboat gets plowed by a whale or hits an iceberg or whatever. And there are 5 people on board. What was the characteristic of that one person who made it till they were found? And it turns out that there are patterns and there are similarities between these people. And so I'm writing a novel that I'm not going to talk about, except to say that there is a deep survival story in it. And I'm learning a lot about why one character might make it and another one might not. And it's more of an adventure than I've written, more directly an adventure. I do have another just firecracker of a female character, but she's not the narrator. It's told in third person, and I'm about halfway along. And in the meantime, what have I been reading? You know what? There's a thing I started about 2 years ago, because I read, quite honestly, about 150 books a year. So I put every Friday, I review a book on Goodreads, and then I link it to my Facebook page, personal page, author page, Instagram, author and personal page, Twitter. I can put it all over social media, and then it goes out of my head. So if you want to know what I've been reading, I really would say, it has not been as many novels as I normally would like to read. The last book I finished was Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. And I just started The Volunteer, which is about the guy who deliberately and intentionally went into Auschwitz to spy for the Allies and to send out information about what was going on there, because the world was denying it. So kind of a real range. The last thriller I loved was The Red Lotus by Chris Bojelian, my good friend, and it turned out to be a little bit prescient because it was about the danger of a pandemic. And it's really great, creepy thriller that also will choke you up at the end. So that's been my list lately.
Thanks. That reminds me, I should point out that Chris Bojelian is going to be presenting The Red Lotus at Northshire Live on June 2nd. So tickets are available for that. There is a comment that someone sent to me, and it's just sort of a statement from a booktopia, longtime booktopian, Linda Johnson. She just wanted me to, I'd like to share with you. She says she's one of the really lucky ones that was able to read an advanced copy of it. And she really appreciated how you challenged her own thought processes. She's explained that it's a love story, love of another person, but also love of country and love of self. And she thinks she's gonna recommend it to a lot of local book discussions, which brings me up to one other point. We've kind of dealt with this already, as you said, with your Goodreads, but traditionally we do ask Booktopia authors to recommend a book. I know you mentioned Red Lotus. Is there anything else that you want to?
Well, I want to look at my stack.
Sure.
Just grabbing randomly. I just finished, it's different kinds of readers, okay? It's different kinds of readers. So I'll say a couple of things. So Trevor Noah, first of all, thank you to Linda, of whom I'm a great fan, for those kind words. Yes, she's somebody I got to know through Booktopia.
She's a force of nature, she is.
I agree. I would not ever want to really be in an argument with her. I just don't think it would go well, but it's because of respect. So Trevor Noah, this book is not, though it's by a comedian, it is not a comic memoir. It is his story of growing up in apartheid South Africa, and it's very compelling. My 23-year-old, who's not a huge reader, ordered a book on his own and curled up with it like it was Harry Potter and he was 14 again. And it was called Everything I Know About Love by Dahlia Adderton. And I read it because it turns out to be sort of a British woman's hilarious and heartbreaking memoir of her romantic life from about age 14 to age 30. And it's really delightful. Misfortunes of Family by Meg Little Riley, who is a Vermonter. And this is one of those books, like, I really wonder, it's a book about a very privileged family and some things go wrong, and how this large cast of characters copes with it. It's very interesting, enormous craft in it. And it's one of those books that I think like is almost going to be an artifact of fiction before the pandemic, because I think our perception of privilege is going to change. And I like this book. I just think like, and then the other book I don't have to hand, but I just finished. It's fantastic. Lou Andrea Salome. Anyone ever heard of her? I had never heard of her. Okay, so she was the daughter of a Russian general who had had 5 sons, and then he had a daughter, and he totally doted on her. He was considered like the toughest guy in Russia, and then he doted on her, and she happened to be brilliant. So in her late teens, she was religious, and there were religious instructors, super like the best religious instructors in Moscow, and one of them completely fell in love with her. And he was married and had children and so on, and she was about 18, and she's like, I have some kind of power here. I wonder what it is. And she set out to kind of find out and test it. The first man who declared her his lifelong muse was Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher. And he followed her around like a puppy dog for about 5 years. And she felt that she could never love him as he wanted. And he went on the rest of his days to say that she was his inspiration. She married, but the marriage was celibate and unconsummated. When she was 36, in a great passionate moment, she lost her virginity to Rilke, the poet. And they had an 8-year torrid romance, following which then she discovered the pleasures of the flesh. She had a number of other romances with great playwrights and composers. And then she went to Vienna, where she was not the lover, but she was the inspiration and confidant and daily arguer with Sigmund Freud. So we've got Nietzsche, Rilke, and Freud, okay? And all 3 of those guys, she was with them before they were famous. She had some capacity to meet and identify these brilliant men and to challenge them in ways that brought them to greatness. And I read this very thorough biography on her, and I got to the end of it, and I thought, nope, the biographer couldn't figure it out either. So it's kind of a mystery, but it's Lou Andrea Salome. She's one of the great puzzles, and obviously one of the great thinkers of the late 19th century. And it being the late 19th century, her name has been lost to history while we all remember the men that she inspired. That's some of what I've been reading lately.
That sounds great. That sounds great. I've got to read that book. And then we've got another question here. I think we only maybe have time for maybe one more question. We'll see if there's any more that pop up into the chat. This is also from Linda.
Okay.
She's curious. You were expecting the publication date was slated to be mid-May, but coronavirus has been around for 2 months. Why the 3-month delay? Wasn't it far enough down the pipeline to be relatively on time?
The book was ready, completely ready. It's printed, it's done. And what happened is that my publisher approached me and said, I need to balance the solitude of my work with time with people. I love to tour. I love to read to people. I love like the hugs and the handshakes and the sign the books and all of that stuff. And this book took twice as long as any other book I've written before. And so I really was craving that. And she knew that. And also she's savvy and she knows that my love of that helps sell books, both. So there was a 28 event tour put together. It was going to start at Booktopia, which is really fun for me to think about. And there was just event after event, sometimes one in Boston in the morning and one in New York in the evening. It was just a great, packed, crazy, exhausting time. And that all went away in the space of about 3 days in March. And so she said, look, we can move it to August and have it very, very close to the anniversary of Hiroshima, and that we might be able to gather people by then. And it really would just be like moving the slot. And I said, let's go for it, because if it comes out May 5th, there are no in-person events. If it comes out in August, perhaps there will be some, and if not, at least we'll know about Zoom and a gathering like this that we wouldn't have known about then. So when she approached me about that, I jumped. I thought that was a salvation. And so, now I'm writing with both of my sons, having escaped New York City. They're roommates in the East Village, and they're working here remotely. And so we each kind of go to our workspace for the day, and then we come together for dinner. And it's an okay thing. And I think that they're going to get back to New York pretty soon. And I think August is still going to be kind of early, but I think that we're not in the kind of degree of crisis that we were. And so maybe I'll be able to meet with readers some. And if not, I intend to tour the paperback of this so thoroughly and fiercely, because I really do miss, I sincerely miss being in the room with readers and the energy of that. Even this is like, it makes my day to see all the faces that are in front of me right now, because it's a solitary, this is my desk. This is where I sit for, about 2,000 hours or so to make a novel. And this one was maybe 3,500, right? That's a lot of hours by yourself. So even this, it's medicine. It's part of what nourishes me and reminds me of the imaginations I want to be working in and bringing the dreams to life in. So thanks for having me here today, because I'm seeing familiar faces and friends and new faces too. And none of them say old girlfriend.
Well, I think what you just said, I think we all really, that chimes with all of us. I mean, we're all love to be in the room. We all love the books. That's why we're in this profession. Rachel and I, at least, and Barb, and all these people are here because of it. We love this, and this is the best we can do, and it's not bad.
That's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. And I should say, like, for my publisher, like, oh, and also, would you please tell everyone, and all of that part, because that's how I make my living. But really, it's about getting to see you, and I really do appreciate that a lot.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much for taking your time. We appreciate it. We all enjoyed this very much. You can pre-order the book. Please do. I have an advanced reader copy right here. Universe of Two. Pre-order it on northshire.com. Next week, if you are interested, we have a special ticketed event on Tuesday with Francis Mays. Buy tickets for that if you'd like. And then on Thursday, another former Booktopia 2020 author, Jessica Anthony, presenting Enter the Aardvark on Thursday at 5 p.m. Thank you all so much. Thank you particularly, Stephen, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Lovely to see you all.
Please stay well.
Yes, take care, everyone, and enjoy and be healthy. Keep reading.
Thank you.